The dust of the Arizona desert swirled like golden specters in the late afternoon sun as Harriet Zimmerman stumbled toward the horizon, each step more painful than the last. Blood seeped through her tattered dress where the bullet had grazed her side, and the memory of her brother's lifeless body sprawled in their ransacked homestead drove her forward despite the agony. It was 1878, and in this unforgiving territory, justice was as scarce as water in the parched landscape that stretched endlessly before her, her vision blurred, the distant town of Redemption appearing as nothing more than a mirage wavering in the heat. She'd been walking for hours, driven by desperation and the wild hope that someone might help her, though experience had taught her better. The townsfolk had made their opinions clear when she'd arrived with her brother 6 months ago. A woman with no husband, no money, and rumors trailing behind her from St. Louis wasn't welcome in polite society. Harriet's knees finally buckled beneath her, the rough earth scraping her palms as she collapsed. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she closed her eyes, wondering if this was where her story would end alone in the dust with no one to mourn her passing. The rhythmic pounding of hooves penetrated her consciousness. A hallucination, she thought, until a shadow fell across her face. "Madam." "You hurt?" The voice was deep, concerned. Harriet forced her eyes open to see a man dismounting from a chestnut stallion, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He knelt beside her and she flinched when he reached toward her. "Easy now, I'm not going to hurt you." She wanted to laugh at the irony but lacked the strength. Instead, she whispered the truth that had followed her across the frontier. "They said I ain't worth saving." The stranger's expression hardened, determination replacing concern as he gently assessed her wound. "Then I'll save you twice." Without further conversation, he carefully lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her to support her limp form. As they rode toward Redemption, Harriet drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of strong arms keeping her from falling and the steady heartbeat at her back. Yancy Abernathy was returning from a cattle drive when he found the woman collapsed in the desert. As the foreman of the Lazy S Ranch, he'd seen his share of hardship, but something about her whispered words struck him deeper than he cared to admit. He'd been told similar things once, back when he was nothing but a boy with a drunkard for a father and a reputation that followed him like a shadow. The town of Redemption appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden structures that had sprung up around the silver mines 10 years earlier. Yancy guided his horse straight to Doc Miller's office, shouting for assistance as he carefully dismounted with the woman in his arms. "What have you brought me now, Abernathy?" Doc Miller emerged from his office, wiping his hands on a stained towel. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the woman. "That's the Zimmerman woman. Heard her brother was found dead at their place this morning." "She's been shot," Yancy replied, ignoring the recognition in the doctor's voice. "Side wound, lost a fair amount of blood." Miller hesitated, glancing around as if concerned about who might be watching. "There's talk about those too. Might be best to let Sheriff Daniels handle this." Yancy's jaw tightened. "She's bleeding, Doc. Whatever talk there is can wait until she's not dying on your doorstep." Something in his tone must have convinced the doctor, who stepped aside to let Yancy carry Harriet into the examination room. As he laid her on the table, her eyes fluttered open, fever bright and disoriented. "My brother," she murmured, clutching weakly at Yancy's sleeve. "They killed Thomas." "Who killed him, madam?" Yancy asked, but she had already slipped back into unconsciousness. Doc Miller moved forward, scissors in hand to cut away the blood-soaked fabric around her wound. "You should fetch the sheriff. This isn't just about a woman needing medical attention anymore." Yancy nodded reluctantly. "Take care of her, Doc. I gave her my word." The doctor looked up, curiosity and something like respect in his weathered face. "Must have been some promise to have you this worked up over a stranger." "I told her I'd save her twice," Yancy replied simply before stepping out into the fading daylight. Sheriff James Daniels was exactly where Yancy expected to find him, nursing a whiskey at the Dusty Boot Saloon. A man more concerned with keeping powerful people happy than upholding the law, Daniels had managed to stay sheriff largely due to his connection to Edmund Hollister, owner of the largest silver mine in the territory. "Abernathy," Daniels acknowledged with barely concealed dislike. Thought you were out with the herd. Just got back, Yancy replied, keeping his voice level despite the tension between them. Found Harriet Zimmerman shot and nearly dead out in the desert. She says someone killed her brother. Daniels's expression didn't change as he set down his glass. Thomas Zimmerman was found dead this morning. Looks like bandits. Probably the same ones who hit the Patterson place last month. And his sister, was she shot by these same bandits? The sheriff shrugged. Could be she got in the way, could be she's running from something else entirely. Those two have been trouble since they arrived, keeping secrets, not mixing with decent folk. Yancy leaned in closer, voice dropping. She's at Doc Miller's now, thought you might want to question her when she wakes up. I'll get to it, Daniels said dismissively. Don't you worry about it, Cowboy. Town business isn't ranch business. A murdered man and his shot sister seem like everybody's business, Yancy countered. The sheriff's eyes hardened. You new to redemption, Abernathy. Oh wait, you're not, so you know how things work here. I decide what's worth investigating, not some ranch hand with ideas above his station. Yancy straightened, recognizing the warning in Daniels's tone. Just doing my civic duty, Sheriff. Good evening to you. Outside the saloon, Yancy paused to consider his next move. His instincts told him there was more to the Zimmerman story than mere bandit trouble, and Daniels's dismissive attitude only reinforced that suspicion. He decided to return to Doc Miller's to check on Harriet. The doctor was washing his hands when Yancy returned, the sharp smell of carbolic acid filling the small office. She'll live, Miller reported without preamble. Bullet grazed her side, painful but not fatal. She's lost blood and has a fever, but she's young and strong. Should pull through with proper care. She have anywhere to go? Yancy asked, glancing toward the closed door that presumably led to where Harriet was resting. Miller shook his head. Their homestead is a crime scene, and even if it weren't, a woman alone out there. He left the thought unfinished. I can keep her here a day or two, but this isn't a hospital. What about the hotel, on whose coin? And besides, the walkers who run it are God-fearing folk. They wouldn't take in a woman of questionable reputation. Yancy's brow furrowed. What exactly are people saying about her? Miller looked uncomfortable. Just talk. The Zimmermans kept to themselves, and folks don't trust what they don't know. There were rumors they left St. Louis in a hurry, debts or something worse. And a single woman living alone with just her brother for protection. Well, people assume things. People always do, Yancy said grimly, remembering all too well how gossip had followed his own family after his mother died. When do you expect she'll wake properly? Hard to say. Fever needs to break first. Tomorrow, maybe the day after. Yancy nodded, making a decision. I'll be back in the morning, and Doc, I'd appreciate if you'd keep it quiet that she's here, at least for now. Miller raised an eyebrow but agreed. Might be wise. Not everyone in town will be glad to hear she survived. Those words followed Yancy as he rode back to the Lazy S Ranch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the land. Someone had killed Thomas Zimmerman and tried to kill his sister. The question was why, and whether the sheriff's indifference was mere laziness or something more sinister. The bunkhouse was quiet when Yancy arrived. Most of the hands either still out with the remaining cattle or in town spending their pay. He reported to the ranch owner, Samuel Stevens, about the successful delivery of the herd before mentioning the injured woman. Stevens was a fair man who'd built his ranch from nothing after the war. Unlike many in the territory, he judged people by their actions rather than their pasts. Bring her here when she's well enough to travel, he offered without hesitation. My wife could use help with the household, and we've got the room. Least we can do is give her a chance to get back on her feet. Thank you, sir, Yancy said, grateful but not entirely surprised by the offer. I gave her my word I'd help. Stevens studied him curiously. Not like you to get involved in town matters, Abernathy. Yancy thought about the desperation in Harriet's whispered words and the determination they'd sparked in him. Guess some things just hit different, sir. The next morning, Yancy rode back to town early, bringing with him some of Mrs. Stevens's clothing that might fit Harriet. Doc Miller met him at the door, looking tired but satisfied. Her fever broke during the night, he reported. She's weak but conscious, been asking about her brother. Has she said anything about who shot her? Miller shook his head. Not to me, but she seems scared, keeps watching the door like she's expecting someone to burst in. Can I speak with her? The doctor hesitated only briefly before nodding. Briefly, she needs rest more than anything. Harriet was propped up on pillows when Yancy entered the small recovery room. Pale and drawn, with dark circles under her eyes, she nevertheless possessed a quiet dignity that struck him immediately. Her copper-colored hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her eyes, a clear, striking green, watched him warily. "Madam," he said, removing his hat. "I don't know if you remember me. Name's Yancy Abernathy. I found you yesterday and brought you to town." Recognition flickered across her face. "The man who promised to save me twice," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I remember. Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. Yancy, please." He placed the bundle of clothing on a nearby chair. "Brought you some things. They belong to Mrs. Stevens from the Lazy S Ranch. She's offered you a place to stay when you're well enough." Surprise, then suspicion crossed her features. "Why would she do that? She doesn't know me. She's a kind woman, and her husband is a good man who believes in helping folks in need." Yancy paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Miss Zimmerman, I need to ask you about what happened. Sheriff Daniels doesn't seem particularly motivated to investigate your brother's murder." Harriet's hands clutched at the thin blanket covering her. "Thomas wasn't just murdered, he was executed, and I'm next if they find out I'm alive." "Who's they?" She looked away, conflict evident in her expression. "I can't. It's not safe for anyone who helps me." Yancy moved closer, keeping his voice low. "Miss Zimmerman, Harriet," she interrupted. "If I'm to call you Yancy, then please call me Harriet." He nodded. "Harriet, then. I don't know what trouble you're in, but I gave you my word yesterday, and I meant it. Whatever's happening, you don't have to face it alone anymore." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a fragile trust, tentative but real. After a long moment, she spoke. "Thomas and I came to Arizona to escape. Our father was a banker in St. Louis. He discovered evidence that his partners were laundering money for a criminal organization. When he threatened to go to the authorities, they killed him and made it look like suicide." Her voice trembled but remained clear. "Thomas found ledgers in our father's study proving what really happened. We took them and ran, changing our name from Zachary to Zimmerman." "And they followed you here?" Yancy asked, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Harriet nodded. "It took them 6 months, but they found us. 3 men came to our homestead yesterday morning. I was gathering eggs when I heard shouting. By the time I got to the house, they had Thomas on his knees." Tears welled in her eyes. "They kept asking about the ledgers. When he wouldn't tell them, they shot him. I ran, but one of them saw me and fired. I managed to get to the trees behind our property and hide until they left." "Do you still have these ledgers?" "Yes. Thomas hid them before they arrived. That's why they killed him. He wouldn't reveal their location." Yancy processed this information, understanding now why Sheriff Daniels had been so dismissive. If powerful men with criminal connections were involved, it was entirely possible the sheriff had been bought. "The men who did this, would you recognize them again?" Harriet's expression hardened. "I'll never forget their faces. One of them was tall with a scar across his chin. Another had a gold front tooth that caught the light when he smiled. The third was older, gray-haired, with expensive clothes. He seemed to be in charge." Yancy nodded slowly. "Harriet, I believe you, but we need those ledgers if we're going to get justice for your brother. Are they safe where Thomas hid them?" "For now," she replied, "but I can't go back there alone." "You won't have to." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if Doc Miller agrees you're strong enough, I'll take you to the Lazy S. Once you're settled there, we'll figure out how to retrieve the ledgers safely." Relief and gratitude flooded her face. "Why are you helping me, Yancy?" "You don't know me. Everyone else in this town seems to think the worst." He considered his answer carefully. "When I was 15, my father drank himself to death after years of making us both outcasts. People said I was destined to follow his path, that I wasn't worth the trouble of helping. A man named Stevens gave me a job anyway, said everyone deserves at least one chance to prove the gossips wrong." He met her gaze directly. "I figure you deserve that same chance." Her eyes softened, and for the first time a small smile curved her lips. "Thank you for everything." Yancy tipped his hat and turned to leave, a strange lightness in his chest despite the dangerous situation they now faced. At the door, he paused. "Try to rest, I'll be back tomorrow morning." Outside, the town of Redemption was coming to life, unaware of the storm brewing in its midst. Yancy decided his first priority was learning more about the men Harriet had described. The saloon would be his best bet, for information bartenders heard everything eventually. The Dusty Boot was nearly empty this early, with only a few dedicated drinkers nursing their morning whiskeys. The bartender, a man named Riley who'd been running the place for as long as anyone could remember, nodded in recognition as Yancy approached. "Bit early for you, isn't it, Abernathy?" Riley asked, already reaching for a glass. "Just information today," Yancy replied quietly. "Wondering if you've seen any strangers in town the last couple days. One with a scarred chin, another with a gold tooth, maybe accompanied by an older gentleman in fine clothes." Riley's hands stilled and he glanced around before leaning closer. "Those men were in here 2 nights ago." Spent freely, asked questions about the Zimmerman place. "Why are you asking?" "Curious," Yancy said casually. "Any idea where they're staying?" "Hotel, I reckon." The older one seemed the type to demand proper accommodations. Riley's eyes narrowed. "This have something to do with Thomas Zimmerman getting killed. Word is it was bandits." "Just following a hunch," Yancy replied, sliding a coin across the bar. "Appreciate the information, Riley. I'd appreciate it even more if you kept our conversation between us." The bartender pocketed the coin with a nod. "Never saw you this morning, Abernathy." Yancy's next stop was the hotel, where a careful conversation with a young maid confirmed that 3 men matching the descriptions were indeed guests, occupying the best suite the modest establishment offered. They had arrived 3 days ago and paid in advance for a week. Armed with this knowledge, Yancy decided it was time to speak with Mr. Stevens about the full situation. As he rode back to the Lazy S, he considered how quickly his simple act of mercy had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. Yet when he thought of Harriet's quiet strength in the face of such adversity, he couldn't bring himself to regret his involvement. The following morning, Doc Miller declared Harriet well enough to travel, though he advised against any strenuous activity for at least another week. Yancy arrived with a wagon borrowed from the ranch, fitted with a mattress and blankets to make the journey as comfortable as possible. "The sheriff's been asking about her," Miller informed Yancy quietly as Harriet gathered her few belongings in the next room. "Came by late yesterday, wanted to know if I'd treated any women for gunshot wounds. I told him I hadn't seen anyone matching her description." "Appreciate that, Doc." Yancy's suspicion about Daniels deepened. "Any particular reason he was asking?" Said he was following up on reports related to the Zimmerman murder, but something felt off about it. The doctor lowered his voice further. "There are 3 men staying at the hotel who have been throwing their weight around town. One of them was with the sheriff when he came by." Yancy nodded grimly. "All the more reason to get her somewhere safe. We'll be leaving town by the back roads, just to be careful." When Harriet emerged, she was dressed in the simple cotton dress Mrs. Stevens had sent, her hair neatly braided. Despite her pallor, there was a determination in her posture that spoke to her resilience. "Ready?" Yancy asked, offering his arm for support. She nodded, taking it with only slight hesitation. "As I'll ever be." They left through the back door of the doctor's office, Yancy helping Harriet into the wagon before covering her with a light blanket, partly for comfort, partly for concealment. The journey to the Lazy S would take about 2 hours at a careful pace, and though they saw occasional riders in the distance, no one approached them. Harriet remained quiet for much of the journey, lost in thought as she watched the landscape pass by. Eventually, she spoke. "I've been thinking about the ledgers. If we retrieve them, what then? The local law won't help us." "Mr. Stevens has connections in Tucson," Yancy explained. "There's a federal marshal there who's honest. If we can get the ledgers to him, he could take action against the men responsible. And in the meantime, these men won't simply give up and leave." Yancy glanced at her, appreciating her clear-eyed assessment of their situation. "The Lazy S has plenty of hands, all loyal to Mr. Stevens. It's as safe a place as you'll find in this territory, and I'll be there too." Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the strange bond forming through shared danger. "I've put you in a difficult position," Harriet said softly. "I'm sorry for that. Don't be. Some things are worth the risk." The Lazy S Ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, a sprawling main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings nestled in a valley with a creek running through it. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and smoke rose lazily from the chimney of the main house. Mrs. Stevens was waiting on the porch as they approached, a warm, motherly woman whose kind face bore the lines of years spent in the harsh frontier sun. She hurried down the steps as Yancy brought the wagon to a halt. "You must be Miss Zimmerman," she said, helping Harriet down with gentle hands. "I'm Martha Stevens. We're so glad to have you here, though I'm terribly sorry about the circumstances." "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Stevens," Harriet replied, genuine gratitude in her voice. "Please call me Harriet." "Then you must call me Martha." "Come inside now. I've prepared a room for you, and there's stew keeping warm on the stove. You look like you could use a good meal." As Martha led Harriet into the house, Yancy went to find Mr. Stevens. He located the rancher in the barn, discussing breeding records with one of the hands. "She's settled in with Mrs. Stevens," Yancy reported when they were alone, "but the situation's more complicated than we thought." He explained everything Harriet had told him about her father's murder, the ledgers, and the men who had tracked them to redemption. Stevens listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. "And you're certain Sheriff Daniels is involved?" he asked when Yancy finished. "Not certain, but it seems likely. He's been asking after her specifically, and one of the killers was seen with him in town." Stevens sighed heavily. "Edmund Hollister has always had Daniels in his pocket. If these criminals have connections to Hollister's mining interests, the sheriff will do whatever they ask." He thought for a moment. "We need those ledgers, and we need to get them to Marshal Cooper in Tucson. He's been trying to build a case against Hollister's operation for years. Harriet says they're hidden at her homestead. I was thinking I could ride out tonight, retrieve them before anyone realizes she's alive and staying here." "Too risky alone," Stevens decided. "Take Roberts and Martinez with you. Good men, both of them, and discreet. Wait until after midnight when there's less chance of anyone watching the place." Yancy agreed, though part of him was reluctant to involve others. "And Harriet, she should be safe here, but if word gets out." "Martha and I will look after her," Stevens assured him. "This isn't the first time we've sheltered someone in need, Yancy. The house has a hidden room beneath the pantry floor, a relic from when Apache raids were common. If trouble comes, we'll keep her safe." That evening after dinner, Yancy found Harriet sitting on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. She looked stronger already, some color returning to her cheeks after a solid meal and the chance to truly rest without fear. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty space beside her. "Please do." She shifted slightly to make room, the swing creaking gently as he sat. "It's beautiful here, peaceful." "It is that," he agreed, following her gaze to the horizon. "Mr. Stevens built this place from nothing after the war. Says he came west looking for peace and found it in this valley." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Harriet spoke again. "Martha told me you've worked here since you were 15, that you started as a stable boy and worked your way up to foreman." Yancy nodded. "Mr. Stevens gave me a chance when no one else would. My father." He hesitated, rarely sharing this part of his past. "He was the town drunk back in a little place called Coopersville. After my mother died, he got worse. I was known as the drunk son, expected to turn out just like him." "But you didn't," Harriet observed softly. "No. When he died, I packed what little I had and started walking, ended up here, half-starved and looking for any work I could find. Mr. Stevens hired me on the spot, said he didn't care about my past, only what I chose to do with my future." Harriet's eyes reflected understanding beyond her years. People are quick to judge, to decide who's worth saving and who isn't. "They are," Yancy agreed, turning slightly to face her. "Which is why I'm riding out tonight with 2 trusted men to retrieve those ledgers from your homestead." Alarm flashed across her face. "That's too dangerous. Those men could be watching the place." "Possibly. but it's a risk we need to take. Once we have the ledgers, Mr. Stevens will arrange for them to reach Marshal Cooper in Tucson. That's your best chance for justice and for ending this threat permanently." Harriet fell silent, conflict evident in her expression. Finally, she reached out hesitantly, her hand coming to rest lightly on his arm. Thomas hid them beneath the loose floorboard under his bed. "You'll need to move the rug first." The unexpected touch sent warmth through Yancy's arm, and he found himself acutely aware of her proximity. "We'll find them," he promised, "and we'll be careful." "Please be safe," she whispered, her voice carrying a depth of concern that suggested she cared about more than just the ledgers. As dusk deepened into night, Yancy met with Roberts and Martinez behind the barn. Both men were longtime hands at the Lazy S, loyal to Stevens and known for their discretion. After explaining the situation and their objective, the three set out under the cover of darkness, taking a circuitous route to avoid being seen from town. The Zimmerman homestead stood dark and silent under the moonlight, the front door still ajar from the violence that had occurred there. Yancy's hand instinctively moved to his revolver as they approached, but there was no sign of anyone watching the property. "Martinez, keep watch outside," Yancy instructed quietly. "Roberts with me." Inside, the small cabin bore the unmistakable signs of struggle: overturned furniture, shattered dishes, and darkened bloodstains on the wooden floor. Yancy tried to push aside the image of Harriet witnessing her brother's execution in this very room as he moved toward the small bedroom at the back. The bed was simple, little more than a frame with a thin mattress, but it had been thoroughly searched, the mattress slashed open, its stuffing scattered across the floor. "They've been here looking for something," Roberts observed grimly. Yancy nodded, moving to roll back the small rug beneath the bed. The floorboard Harriet had described was still in place, though it took some effort to pry it up with his knife. Beneath it lay a small metal box, which Yancy quickly retrieved. "Is that it?" Roberts asked, keeping his voice low. "Must be." Yancy tucked the box inside his jacket. "Let's go." Outside, Martinez hissed a warning from his position near the front door. "Riders coming, at least 3 moving fast." Yancy's mind raced. Out the back now. They slipped through the rear door just as the sound of hooves grew louder. Keeping low, they made their way to where their horses were tethered in a small grove of trees behind the homestead. "Spread out," one of the approaching men called, his voice carrying in the night air. "Check everywhere. If those ledgers are here, I want them found tonight." Mounting silently, Yancy and the others urged their horses deeper into the trees before turning south, away from both the homestead and the direct route back to the Lazy S. They would circle around, a longer journey but safer than risking pursuit. The metal box pressed against Yancy's chest as they rode, a physical reminder of all that was at stake. For Thomas Zimmerman, it had cost him his life. For Harriet, it represented her only chance at justice. And for Yancy, it had somehow become a symbol of the promise he'd made to save her not once, but twice. Dawn was breaking when they finally returned to the ranch, exhaustion heavy in their bones but the mission accomplished. Mrs. Stevens met them at the door, her expression grave. "There's trouble," she said without preamble. "Sheriff Daniels was here last night with those men Harriet described. They were looking for her." Yancy's heart raced. "Is she safe?" Mrs. Stevens assured him quickly. "Samuel got her into the hidden room before they arrived." "But they're watching the ranch now, Yancy. A rider's been circling the property since they left." "We have the ledgers," Yancy told her, patting his jacket. "We need to get them to Tucson as soon as possible. Samuel's already making arrangements. Come inside, you look dead on your feet." In the kitchen, Yancy found Mr. Stevens and, to his relief, Harriet, pale but unharmed. She rose quickly when she saw him, relief flooding her features. "You're back," she said simply, the worry in her voice betraying how concerned she'd been. Yancy removed the metal box from inside his jacket and placed it on the table. As promised, Stevens examined the box carefully before opening it. Inside were several leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with neat columns of figures and names. "These are it," Harriet confirmed, touching one of the books reverently. "My father died for these, and Thomas," Stevens nodded grimly. I've sent word to Marshal Cooper through our regular supply runner. He left at first light, taking the southern route to avoid being seen. With any luck, Cooper will be here within 3 days. 3 days is a long time, Yancy observed, and if they're watching the ranch. We need a distraction, Stevens agreed. Something to keep Daniels and his criminal friends occupied while we wait for the marshal. Harriet, who had been examining one of the ledgers, looked up suddenly. There's a name in here that might be useful. Edmund Hollister. According to my father's notes, he's been laundering money from his mining operation through the St. Louis Bank for years. Stevens and Yancy exchanged significant looks. Hollister practically owns Redemption, Stevens explained. If he's involved, that explains Daniels's cooperation. It also gives us leverage, Yancy added thoughtfully. If word got out about Hollister's criminal activities, he'd have more to worry about than finding Harriet or the ledgers. A dangerous game, Stevens cautioned, but it might buy us the time we need. They spent the morning developing a plan. Martinez would ride to the neighboring ranches, spreading carefully selected rumors about Hollister's business practices, while Roberts would return to town under the pretense of supply shopping, letting similar information slip at the saloon. And what about me? Harriet asked when they'd finished outlining the strategy. I can't hide in that room for 3 days. No, Yancy agreed, and it might not be safe for you to stay here at all. If Daniels decides to come back with a search warrant, they could turn this place upside down. Where would I go? Her voice held no fear, only practical concern. Yancy considered for a moment. There's a line cabin about 10 miles north of here, near the canyon. It's isolated, used mainly during spring roundup. No one would think to look for you there. Stevens nodded in agreement. It's well stocked, too. You could stay comfortably for several days if needed. I'll take her, Yancy decided. Tonight, after dark, we'll use the creek bed for part of the way to mask our tracks. As the others dispersed to put their parts of the plan into motion, Yancy found himself alone with Harriet in the kitchen. She was still examining the ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration. You should rest before tonight, he suggested gently. It'll be a rough ride to the line cabin. She looked up, a small smile touching her lips. I've had worse journeys. But you're the one who needs rest. You've been up all night. He couldn't argue with her logic. Wake me if anything changes, he requested, reluctantly heading toward the bunkhouse. Despite his exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Images of Harriet wounded in the desert, of Thomas Zimmerman's execution, and of the men hunting them blended together in his dreams. When he finally gave up and rose in the late afternoon, he felt only marginally refreshed. Dinner was a quiet affair, tension hanging in the air as they waited for nightfall. Roberts had returned from town with news that their plan was working. Rumors about Hollister were spreading rapidly, and the businessman had reportedly called an urgent meeting with his associates. They'll be distracted, at least for tonight, Stevens concluded. You two should leave as soon as it's fully dark. Mrs. Stevens had packed provisions for them, enough food for several days, medical supplies for Harriet's still healing wound, and extra ammunition for Yancy's revolver. As the last light faded from the sky, they prepared to depart. The ledgers stay here, Stevens decided. Too risky to move them again until the marshal arrives. Yancy helped Harriet mount a sturdy mare selected for her even temperament, noting with approval that despite her injury, Harriet sat confidently in the saddle. He'd seen town women who couldn't ride half as well after years of practice. Keep to the creek as much as possible, Stevens advised as they prepared to leave. And Yancy, take care of her. The unspoken meaning behind those words wasn't lost on Yancy, who had noticed Stevens watching his interactions with Harriet with knowing eyes. With my life, sir, he replied simply. They rode out under a cloudy sky, the moon occasionally breaking through to light their way as they descended into the creek bed that would lead them north. Harriet remained silent, focused on the journey, though Yancy could see the tension in her shoulders. How's your side? He asked when they paused to water the horses after an hour of riding. Sore, she admitted, but bearable. I've had worse. Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. Have you? She met his gaze steadily. Life hasn't always been easy, even before all this. When our mother died, our father retreated into his work. Thomas practically raised me. We learned to be strong, to handle pain without complaint. Yancy nodded in understanding. My mother was the same way, used to say complaining about a burden never made it lighter. She sounds wise, Harriet said softly. You must miss her. Every day, he admitted, surprised by his own candor. She taught me everything important: how to read, how to treat others with respect, how to stand up again after life knocks you down. They continued their journey, the conversation flowing more easily now as they shared pieces of their lives. Harriet spoke of growing up in St. Louis, of her love for books and music, of her brother's dream to start a newspaper someday. Yancy told her about his years at the Lazy S, about learning to break horses and drive cattle, about the satisfaction of building something honest with his hands and heart. The line cabin appeared just after midnight, a small but sturdy structure nestled against a rocky outcropping. Yancy helped Harriet dismount, noting with concern the way she winced as her feet touched the ground. "Let me check your wound when we get inside," he said, no room for argument in his tone. Mrs. Stevens sent fresh bandages. The cabin's interior was simple: a single room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. Yancy lit the lamp and built a fire in the stove while Harriet sank gratefully onto the edge of the bed. "I'll need to see the wound," he said, approaching with the medical supplies Mrs. Stevens had packed. Harriet hesitated only briefly before turning slightly and lifting the side of her dress to reveal the bandaged area just above her hip. Yancy worked quickly and professionally, cleaning the wound and applying fresh bandages, but he couldn't help noticing the softness of her skin beneath his calloused fingers. "Thank you," she said quietly when he'd finished, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "For everything, most men would have ridden past a stranger in the desert." "I'm not most men," he replied simply, aware of how close they were sitting, of the lamplight casting a warm glow on her features. "No," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings developing despite the danger surrounding them, or perhaps because of it. Yancy found himself wanting to reach for her hand, to draw her closer, but reminded himself of her vulnerable position and the trust she'd placed in him. Instead, he stood and moved to check that the cabin's shutters were secure. "You should take the bed," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "I'll sleep in the chair." Harriet looked like she might protest, but ultimately nodded, fatigue evident in every line of her body. "Wake me if you need to rest." "I can take a turn keeping watch." Despite his determination to remain vigilant, exhaustion eventually claimed Yancy as well. He dozed in the chair, his revolver in his lap, waking at every sound from the wilderness outside. Sometime before dawn, he must have fallen into a deeper sleep, for he awoke with a start to find early morning light filtering through the shutters and Harriet standing at the small window, peering outside. "Everything all right?" he asked, immediately alert. She turned, a small smile on her face. "Just watching the sunrise. It's beautiful here, so different from the city." Yancy joined her at the window, careful to stay to the side where he wouldn't be visible from outside. The canyon stretched before them, painted in hues of pink and gold as the sun climbed above the horizon. "It is beautiful," he agreed, though he found his gaze drawn more to her profile than to the landscape. They spent the day in the cabin, talking when conversation came naturally, comfortable in silence when it didn't. Yancy showed Harriet how to use his spare revolver just in case, he said, and she nodded with serious understanding. As dusk approached, he grew increasingly restless, wondering how the plan was progressing back in redemption. What if the marshal doesn't come? Harriet asked suddenly, voicing the concern that had been nagging at both of them. "Then we find another way," Yancy replied with more confidence than he felt. "The ledgers are solid evidence. If Cooper can't come to us, we'll find a way to get them to him." Harriet studied him for a moment. "You always see a way forward, don't you, even when things seem impossible?" He shrugged slightly. "Had to learn that early. Giving up wasn't an option if I wanted something better than my father's life." "I admire that," she said softly. "When Thomas was killed, I almost gave up. Just lay down in the desert and waited to die. But then you found me, and suddenly there was a path forward again." Their eyes met, and Yancy felt a pull toward her that had nothing to do with their shared danger and everything to do with the woman herself, her courage, her intelligence, the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Yancy was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand as he moved to the window. "Someone's coming," he said tersely. "Single rider moving fast." Harriet retrieved the revolver he'd given her, her hands steady as she checked that it was loaded. "Could be from the ranch with news." "Could be," Yancy agreed, though his instincts were screaming caution. "Stay back from the window." As the rider drew closer, Yancy relaxed slightly, recognizing Martinez's distinctive riding style. He cracked the door open when the ranch hand reined in before the cabin. "Mr. Stevens sent me," Martinez said without preamble. "Marshal Cooper arrived early this morning with 2 deputies. They've arrested Daniels and are gathering evidence against Hollister. The men who killed Thomas Zimmerman tried to flee town, but they were caught at the pass." Relief washed over Yancy. "It's over, almost. Mr. Stevens says you should bring Miss Zimmerman back to the ranch. The marshal wants her statement, and she'll need to testify eventually, but she's safe now." Harriet had moved to stand beside Yancy, her shoulder just touching his arm. "They're really arrested, all of them," Martinez nodded. "Hollister, too. Apparently, those ledgers contained enough evidence to bring down his entire operation. The marshal had been building a case against him for years. This was just what he needed to make it stick." They rode back to the Lazy S as a pale moon rose in the eastern sky. Harriet was quiet, and Yancy respected her silence, understanding that justice, while welcome, couldn't erase the grief of losing her brother and father. At the ranch, they found Marshal Cooper waiting with Mr. and Mrs. Stevens, a tall, weathered man with keen eyes and a reputation for incorruptibility. Cooper greeted Harriet with respectful sympathy. "Miss Zimmerman, I'm truly sorry for your losses," he said, removing his hat. "Your father was a brave man to stand up to those criminals, and your brother as well. Their sacrifices won't be in vain, we'll make sure of that." Harriet straightened her shoulders, dignity in every line of her posture. "Thank you, Marshal. What happens now? The men who murdered your brother are in custody, along with Sheriff Daniels and Edmund Hollister. They'll be transported to Tucson for trial. We'll need your testimony, but that can wait until you've had time to recover." "What about our homestead?" she asked practically. "All our possessions are safe," Mrs. Stevens interjected gently. "I've already sent some of the hands to collect your things. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need, dear." Later, after Harriet had given her statement to Marshal Cooper and retired to rest, Yancy stood on the porch with Mr. Stevens, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You did well, son," Stevens said, his usual gruffness softened by genuine pride. "Saved that young woman's life twice over, just like you promised." Yancy smiled slightly at the reminder of his impulsive vow. "Seems like a lifetime ago that I found her in the desert. And now?" Stevens asked, a knowing look in his eyes. "Now." Yancy hesitated, uncertain how to articulate the feelings that had developed for Harriet in such a short time. "I don't know, she'll have options now, could go back east, start fresh somewhere else." Stevens clapped him on the shoulder. "Or she might find reason to stay. That's up to you as much as her, I reckon." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Marshal Cooper's men secured convictions for all involved in the criminal operation. Harriet testified with quiet dignity, her clear recounting of events leaving no doubt about the guilt of her brother's killers. When the trial concluded, she faced the decision Stevens had predicted what to do next. "I've been offered a position teaching at the school in Tucson," she told Yancy one evening as they sat on the porch swing that had become their customary spot for conversation. "Marshal Cooper arranged it, says they're desperate for educated women willing to brave the territories." Yancy felt his heart sink but kept his expression neutral. "Sounds like a good opportunity. Tucson's growing fast, safer than a small homestead, too." Harriet studied him for a moment, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I haven't accepted yet." "Oh." He tried not to sound too hopeful. "Having second thoughts." "Not exactly." She looked out across the ranch, where the day's work was winding down as the sun sank toward the horizon. "I've been thinking about something you said the day you found me." Yancy waited, not trusting himself to speak. You promised to save me twice, she continued softly. And you did first by bringing me to town when I was injured, then by helping me get justice for Thomas and my father. She turned to face him fully. But I've realized something, Yancy. While you were saving me, I think I was finding something worth staying for. His heart hammered in his chest as he met her gaze. Harriet, I don't need saving anymore, she interrupted gently, but I do need to know if there's a reason I should decline that teaching position, a reason to stay. Yancy reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. I can think of at least one, he said, his voice rough with emotion. If you'll have me. The smile that bloomed across her face was answer enough, but she spoke the words anyway. I will. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of all that might come, sweet with the knowledge that they had both found something neither had expected, not just safety or justice, but love born in the midst of danger, strengthened by shared purpose, and now free to grow in peace. Epilogue 5 years later, the Lazy S Ranch had flourished in the years since Edmund Hollister's criminal empire had fallen. With his corrupting influence gone, honest businesses thrived in redemption, including the small school where Harriet Abernathy taught 3 days a week. The remaining days she spent at the ranch, she now shared with Yancy, who had become Stevens's partner when the older man began thinking about retirement. Their cabin, built on a rise overlooking the creek, was modest but comfortable, filled with books Harriet treasured and furniture Yancy had crafted with his own hands. On this particular evening, they sat together on their porch, watching their 3-year-old daughter Emma chase fireflies in the yard. Harriet leaned against Yancy's shoulder, his arm around her waist, their second child growing beneath her heart. Do you ever think about how it all began? She asked softly. That day in the desert, Yancy pressed a kiss to her temple. Sometimes, mostly I think about how lucky I am that I was riding that way. Not luck, Harriet countered with the certainty that had become her hallmark. Fate, I was meant to collapse exactly where you would find me. He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. However it happened, I'm grateful every day. Emma ran up to the porch, her small hands cupped carefully around something. Look, Papa, I caught one. Yancy lifted her onto his lap, and they all watched the firefly glow briefly before Harriet gently suggested, Maybe we should let it go now, sweetheart. Sometimes the things we save need to fly free. As Emma released the insect and they watched it soar away, Yancy's eyes met Harriet's over their daughter's head, both remembering the words that had brought them together, a desperate whisper about not being worth saving, and a promise made and kept twice over. But the truth, as they had discovered together, was that in saving each other, they had both found something far more precious than mere rescue. They had found home.